In a quiet little neighborhood tucked away in Washington, D.C., life usually moved at a slow and predictable pace. The streets were lined with neat houses, kids played basketball on cracked driveways, and the air carried the faint hum of lawnmowers cutting grass under the afternoon sun. But one evening, something happened that would shake this peaceful suburb, and the entire country, to its core. Officer Daniel Harper was wrapping up another long shift. He had been a cop for over 20 years, but his reputation wasn't exactly spotless. Over time, whispers about him had started to spread. Some people said he treated everyone fairly, but others claimed he often singled out individuals based on their race. Complaints against him piled up quietly behind closed doors, but nothing stuck, until now. That night, as Harper drove through the area, he noticed something unusual. A shiny black luxury sedan parked outside a small cafe. It looked expensive, almost too polished for this part of town. To make matters more suspicious, the car bore government license plates, but there were no markings or insignias indicating it belonged to any official agency. Harper's instincts kicked in immediately. He pulled his patrol car over and stepped out, his boots crunching against the gravel. His hand rested casually on the baton clipped to his belt as he approached the vehicle. Peering inside, he saw nothing out of place. A few papers scattered on the passenger seat, an empty coffee cup in the holder. Nothing alarming, yet something gnawed at him. Why was such a fancy car sitting here? Who did it belong to? And why did it feel so out of place? Harper didn't know then, but this seemingly ordinary moment would spiral into chaos. After checking the plates, he discovered they were registered to none other than the director of the FBI, the highest-ranking person in federal law enforcement. Not only that, but the director was also the first African American to hold the position, making headlines across the nation just months before. Instead of feeling a sense of respect or caution, Harper felt anger bubbling inside him. He couldn't explain it fully, not even to himself. Maybe it was frustration, maybe jealousy, or maybe something deeper rooted in prejudice. Whatever it was, it clouded his judgment completely. Without thinking twice, he grabbed his baton and slammed it hard against the windshield. Glass shattered everywhere, scattering shards onto the pavement. Then, fueled by rage, Harper went further. He kicked the side panels, leaving deep dents in the once pristine car. Finally, he took out his pocket knife and slashed all 4 tires, letting the air hiss out slowly. What Harper didn't realize was that everything he did was being recorded. A security camera mounted above the cafe captured every move he made. The way he stood menacingly beside the car, the destruction he caused, and the smug look on his face when he finished. Unaware of the digital witness, Harper got back into his patrol car and drove off, leaving behind a scene that would soon explode into national outrage. The very next morning, images of the damaged car flooded social media. People couldn't believe what they were seeing. How could a police officer, someone sworn to protect and serve, do something like this to the property of the FBI director? News outlets picked up the story within hours, turning it into a full-blown scandal. The video footage spread like wildfire, showing Harper's violent actions in crystal-clear detail. Viewers watched in disbelief as comment sections filled with anger and demands for justice. For many, this incident wasn't just about a single act of vandalism. It hit a nerve because it highlighted bigger issues simmering beneath the surface. Stories began surfacing about Harper's past behavior, how he'd allegedly targeted people of color during traffic stops, how he'd used excessive force without justification, and how complaints against him had mysteriously disappeared. This wasn't just one bad apple. It was a symptom of something much larger. As the day wore on, the pressure mounted. Calls for accountability grew louder, echoing from every corner of the country. Politicians weighed in, activists organized protests, and ordinary citizens shared their own experiences of mistreatment at the hands of law enforcement. Everyone wanted answers, everyone wanted change, and everyone agreed on one thing: Officer Daniel Harper needed to pay for what he'd done. Little did Harper know, his world was about to collapse around him. What started as a simple patrol shift had turned into a nightmare, one that wouldn't end anytime soon. The morning after the incident, the nation woke up to a storm. Social media feeds were flooded with images of the damaged car, and hashtags demanding justice trended across platforms. People couldn't stop talking about it. News anchors scrambled to cover the story, replaying the security footage over and over again. It was hard to look away from the raw anger on display, the baton smashing through glass, the deliberate kicks denting metal, the knife slicing into rubber tires. The video wasn't just shocking, it felt personal. For many, this wasn't just about one man losing control. It was about power, privilege, and accountability. Conversations erupted everywhere, in living rooms, coffee shops, workplaces. Parents discussed it with their kids, teachers brought it up in classrooms, and friends debated late into the night. How could someone sworn to uphold the law act so recklessly? Why did it seem like certain people always got away with things while others didn't? These questions lingered heavy in the air. As the hours passed, details about the officer involved began to surface. Reporters dug deep, uncovering a troubling pattern. This wasn't the first time he'd been accused of misconduct. In fact, there were whispers. Lots of them. Residents who lived in the neighborhoods he patrolled spoke out, sharing stories they'd kept quiet about for years. One woman recalled being pulled over repeatedly for minor infractions, even though she hadn't broken any rules. Another man described how the officer had shouted at him during a routine traffic stop, making him feel small and powerless. These accounts painted a picture of someone who didn't just make mistakes, but seemed to thrive on intimidating others. But what really struck a chord was the timing. This happened to the FBI director, a figurehead of justice and integrity, someone who represented progress in a system often criticized for its biases. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. For decades, communities of color had spoken out about unfair treatment by law enforcement. Now, here was undeniable proof captured on camera, showing exactly what some officers were capable of when they thought no one was watching. Public outrage reached a fever pitch. Protesters gathered outside police headquarters, holding signs that read, "Justice over bias and accountability starts here." Community leaders called emergency meetings to discuss next steps. Even politicians, usually hesitant to take sides, joined the chorus calling for transparency and action. The message was clear. Enough was enough. People wanted answers, and they wanted them now. Meanwhile, the police department found itself under intense scrutiny. Officials huddled in closed-door meetings, trying to figure out how to handle the fallout. At first, they tried to distance themselves from the officer, releasing a carefully worded statement condemning his actions. But the public wasn't buying it. Critics pointed out that if the department had taken earlier complaints seriously, none of this might have happened. Trust between the community and law enforcement, already fragile, began to crumble further. Amid all the chaos, the FBI director broke his silence. Standing before reporters, he addressed the nation with calm authority. He acknowledged the pain and frustration people were feeling, but urged everyone to let the legal process play out. "This is not just about me," he said, his voice steady but firm. "It's about ensuring fairness and respect for all individuals, regardless of who they are or where they come from." His words resonated deeply, offering a sense of hope amidst the turmoil. Back at the precinct, tension hung thick in the OWA air. Officers whispered nervously in hallways, unsure of what would happen next. Some defended their colleague, claiming he must have had a reason for acting the way he did. Others stayed silent, avoiding eye contact, knowing full well that defending him wouldn't sit well with the growing number of critics. Behind the scenes, higher-ups scrambled to contain the damage. They suspended the officer without pay, citing the need for an internal investigation. But to many, it felt like too little. Too late. As days turned into weeks, the story dominated. Headlines. Late-night talk show hosts joked about it. Comedians used it as material for stand-up routines, and opinion pieces poured in from every corner of the media landscape. Yet beneath the humor and commentary lay a deeper truth. Something fundamental needed to change. People weren't just upset about a smashed car, they were angry about a system that allowed such behavior to go unchecked for so long. In the midst of all this, the officer at the center of the controversy remained largely invisible. No interviews, no apologies, nothing. Rumors swirled about where he was hiding. Some said he'd gone into seclusion, while others claimed he was defiantly sticking to his guns. Whatever the case, his absence only fueled more speculation. Was he feeling guilty? Scared? Or did he still believe he'd done nothing wrong? By the end of the second week, the pressure became unbearable. Federal investigators stepped in, taking over the case from local authorities. Evidence piled up: security footage, witness testimonies, records of past complaints. Each piece added weight to the mounting case against him. Lawyers debated strategies, journalists chased leads, and activists kept pushing for reform. Everyone knew this was far from over. What started as a single act of vandalism had snowballed into something much bigger. It wasn't just about one bad decision or one rogue officer anymore. It was about confronting uncomfortable truths and holding those in power accountable. And as the nation waited anxiously for the next chapter to unfold, one thing was certain: lives had already been changed forever, and not just the officers. The pressure on the police department kept building, and it felt like a ticking time bomb ready to explode. The officer at the center of the scandal was holed up somewhere, avoiding the public eye, but his absence only made things worse. People wanted answers, and they wanted them fast. Every day that passed without action fueled more anger, more protests, and louder demands for justice. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the system that had allowed someone like him to stay in power for so long. At first, the department tried to play it cool. They issued vague statements about internal investigations and due process, hoping to buy some time. But the public wasn't having it. Protesters camped outside the police station, holding signs and chanting slogans. Some even brought megaphones, shouting questions at anyone who walked in or out of the building. Reporters camped there too, shoving microphones into the faces of officers and demanding updates. The once quiet precinct now felt like the center of a national storm. Behind closed doors, the higher-ups were scrambling. Meetings stretched late into the night as officials debated what to do next. Some argued for leniency, saying the officer had served for decades and deserved a second chance. Others pushed back, pointing out that this wasn't his first strike. He'd been accused of misconduct before, and those warnings had gone ignored. The tension in the room was palpable, with voices rising and tempers flaring. Everyone knew this decision would define how the department was seen for years to come. Meanwhile, investigators worked tirelessly, piecing together evidence to build a case. Security footage from the cafe showed every detail of the vandalism: the baton smashing the windshield, the kicks denting the car, the knife slicing the tires. Witnesses came forward recounting what they'd seen that night. One woman who worked at the cafe described hearing loud noises and stepping outside to find the officer in the middle of his destructive rampage. She said she'd never forget the look on his face, cold, angry, almost detached, like he didn't care who saw him. Then there were the records. Past complaints against the officer were pulled from archives, some dating back years. Residents who had filed grievances spoke out, sharing their stories publicly for the first time. A young man recounted being pulled over repeatedly for no reason other than driving through certain neighborhoods. An elderly woman talked about how the officer had shouted at her during a routine traffic stop, reducing her to tears. These accounts painted a troubling picture, not of isolated incidents, but of a pattern of behavior that had gone unchecked for far too long. As the evidence mounted, it became clear that suspension wouldn't be enough. This wasn't just a bad day at work. It was a culmination of years of questionable actions. Federal authorities stepped in, taking over the case entirely. For many, this was a relief. It meant the investigation wouldn't be handled internally, where bias might cloud judgment. But for others, it was terrifying. If federal prosecutors got involved, the stakes would skyrocket. This wasn't just about losing a job anymore. It could mean criminal charges. And then came the announcement everyone had been waiting for. The officer was fired. The news broke late one evening, sending shockwaves through the community. Social media lit up instantly, with people reacting in real time. Some cheered, calling it a victory for accountability. Others expressed skepticism, wondering if this was just a way to make the problem disappear without addressing deeper issues within the system. Either way, it was a turning point. But the story didn't end there. Losing his badge was only the beginning of the officer's downfall. Federal prosecutors announced they would press charges, citing destruction of federal property and violations of civil rights laws. Suddenly, the stakes grew even higher. He wasn't just facing unemployment, he was looking at prison time. The idea of a veteran cop going to jail sent ripples through law enforcement circles. Some defended him, saying the punishment was too harsh. Others admitted quietly that it was long overdue. For the officer himself, life unraveled quickly. Friends stopped returning calls. Neighbors avoided eye contact when he ventured outside. His family withdrew, embarrassed by the constant attention. Once used to commanding respect, or at least fear, he now found himself isolated, abandoned by the very system he'd served for so long. Rumors swirled about his mental state. Was he regretful, remorseful, or was he still convinced he'd done nothing wrong? Back in the community, reactions were mixed. Some celebrated the firing and pending charges as a step toward justice. Activists organized rallies, using the case to highlight broader issues of bias and misconduct in policing. Teachers brought it up in classrooms, sparking discussions about fairness and accountability. Even casual conversations at grocery stores and bus stops revolved around the scandal. It was impossible to ignore. Others, however, worried about what this meant for law enforcement as a whole. Would officers become hesitant to act, fearing backlash even when doing their jobs? Could trust between the community and police ever be rebuilt? These questions lingered unanswered, adding another layer of complexity to an already messy situation. As the weeks dragged on, preparations for the trial began. Lawyers pored over documents, strategizing how to present their cases. Prosecutors focused on painting a picture of a man whose actions reflected deep-seated prejudice. Defense attorneys countered by arguing that the incident was a momentary lapse in judgment, not indicative of who he truly was. Both sides knew the stakes were high. This wasn't just about one person, it was about setting a precedent. In the midst of all this, the FBI director remained a steady presence. He continued to speak out, urging calm and emphasizing the importance of letting the legal process play out. His measured approach earned him praise, but it also drew criticism from those who felt he should push harder for systemic change. Still, he persisted, determined to use this moment as an opportunity to drive progress rather than division. By the time the trial date was set, the nation was holding its breath. What started as a single act of vandalism had spiraled into something much bigger, a test of whether accountability could prevail in a system often criticized for protecting its own. For the officer, it was a fight for redemption or survival. For everyone else, it was a chance to see if justice could truly be served. As the courtroom loomed ahead, one thing was certain. Lives had already been changed forever, and no matter how the trial ended, the scars left behind would take years to heal, if they ever did. The courtroom was packed long before the trial began. People lined up early, hoping to secure a seat for what promised to be one of the most talked-about cases in recent memory. Reporters with their notebooks and cameras jostled for space near the front, while activists held signs outside, chanting slogans about justice and accountability. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. Every cough echoed loudly. Every shuffle of papers seemed louder than usual. This wasn't just another legal proceeding. It felt like history unfolding in real time. When the defendant walked in, escorted by two bailiffs, the room fell silent. The officer, who had once worn a badge with pride, now looked smaller somehow. His shoulders slumped as he took his seat at the defense table. He avoided eye contact with the crowd, staring straight ahead as if trying to block out the weight of everyone's gaze. For weeks he'd been vilified in the media, labeled as a symbol of everything wrong with law enforcement. Now, here he was, facing the consequences head-on. The prosecution team wasted no time laying out their case. Their opening statement was sharp and direct, painting a vivid picture of a man driven by prejudice and unchecked authority. They showed the security footage again, the baton smashing through glass, the kicks denting metal, the knife slicing into rubber tires. Each frame felt heavier this time, not because it was new, but because it carried the full weight of its context. Prosecutors reminded the jury that this wasn't just vandalism. It was an attack on trust, on fairness, on the very idea of equal treatment under the law. Then came the witnesses. One by one, they stepped forward to share their stories. There was the cafe worker who had seen the incident unfold firsthand. Her voice trembled slightly as she described hearing the crash of breaking glass and stepping outside to find the officer mid-rampage. "I didn't understand why he was doing it," she said softly. "It felt personal." Next came residents, from neighborhoods where the officer had patrolled. A young man recounted being pulled over multiple times for minor infractions, or sometimes for no reason at all. "He never gave me a chance to explain," the man said, his frustration evident. "It was like I was guilty before I even opened my mouth." An elderly woman followed, her hands shaking as she spoke about how the officer had shouted at her during a routine traffic stop. "I've lived in this town my whole life," she said, tears welling up in her eyes. "And suddenly, I felt like I didn't belong anymore." Each testimony added another layer to the narrative, turning isolated incidents into a pattern of behavior. The prosecution argued that these weren't random mistakes. They were evidence of a mindset shaped by bias and entitlement. They urged the jury to see beyond the individual actions and recognize the broader implications. "This isn't just about one person," the lead prosecutor said, his voice steady but firm. "It's about holding people accountable when they abuse their power. It's about sending a message that no one is above the law." On the other side, the defense team fought back fiercely. They admitted that what happened was wrong, but argued that it was a momentary lapse in judgment, not indicative of who the officer truly was. They called character witnesses, former colleagues, friends, even family members, who spoke about his dedication to his job and his commitment to serving the community. One retired detective described him as a good cop who made a bad decision. Another witness, a neighbor, talked about how he always helped shovel snow off driveways in winter or offered assistance when someone needed it. But the defense's strongest argument centered around intent. They claimed the officer hadn't acted out of malice, but rather frustration, a misguided attempt to assert control in a situation he misunderstood. "He snapped," one of his attorneys said during closing arguments. "Does that excuse what he did? No. But does it mean he deserves a second chance? Absolutely." Despite their efforts, cracks began to show in the defense's case. Cross-examinations revealed inconsistencies in some testimonies, and jurors exchanged skeptical glances when old complaints against the officer were brought up again. The prosecution hammered home the point that patterns matter, that repeated accusations of misconduct couldn't simply be dismissed as coincidence. As the trial dragged on, emotions ran high both inside and outside the courtroom. Outside, protests continued, with crowds growing larger each day. Activists used megaphones to amplify voices calling for systemic change, while families shared their own experiences of mistreatment by law enforcement. Some supporters of the officer showed up too, holding signs that read "Justice for all" and "Don't vilify our heroes." Tensions flared occasionally, but for the most part, the demonstrations remained peaceful. Inside, the jury deliberated for days. The wait was agonizing, for the officer, for the public, for everyone invested in the outcome. When the verdict finally came down, the courtroom erupted in gasps. Guilty on all counts, destruction of federal property, civil rights violations, it was all there. The judge sentenced him to 5 years in prison, stripped him of his pension, and ordered him to pay restitution for the damages. As the gavel struck, signaling the end of the trial, the room buzzed with reactions ranging from cheers to stunned silence. For the officer, the reality of his situation hit hard. Once accustomed to wearing a uniform and carrying a badge, he now faced a future behind bars. His lawyer promised to appeal, but for now the damage was done. Supporters tried to rally around him, arguing that the punishment was too harsh, but many others saw it as a necessary step toward accountability. Outside the courthouse, the mood was electric. Protesters cheered, hugging each other and raising fists in triumph. Activists declared it a victory, not just for themselves, but for anyone who had ever felt powerless against the system. Journalists rushed to file reports capturing the historic moment for posterity. Social media exploded with reactions, trending hashtags celebrating justice served. Yet amid the celebrations, questions lingered. Would this case spark real change? Or would it fade into memory like so many others before it? Could law enforcement rebuild trust with communities that had long felt betrayed? And what about the officer himself? Would he learn from this experience, or would bitterness consume him? As the sun set on the courthouse steps, casting long shadows across the cheering crowd, one thing was clear. This trial had left an indelible mark. It wasn't just about one man's downfall. It was about confronting uncomfortable truths and demanding better. Whether it would lead to lasting progress remained to be seen. But for now, hope flickered brightly in the hearts of those who refused to look away. The verdict sent shockwaves through the nation, but it wasn't just about one man being held accountable. It was a wake-up call for an entire system. In the days and weeks that followed, people began to reflect on what this case meant for law, enforcement, for communities, and for the future of justice in the country. The guilty verdict was more than a legal outcome. It was a symbol of hope for some and a source of fear for others. And as the dust settled, conversations turned toward one big question. What happens now? For the officer, life behind bars became a harsh reality. Prison was a far cry from the world he'd known, once used to commanding respect, or at least obedience. He now found himself stripped of all authority. His first few days inside were rough. Fellow inmates gave him cold stares, muttering under their breath about dirty cops who thought they were above the law. Some even taunted him openly, calling him out for his actions. It was clear that no one here sympathized with him. At first, he tried to keep to himself, sticking close to the walls during mealtimes and avoiding eye contact with anyone who passed by. But isolation didn't shield him completely. Rumors spread quickly among inmates about why he was there, how he'd smashed up the car of someone high-ranking, how he'd let his anger get the better of him. Some mocked him for losing everything over something so petty. Others saw him as proof that even those in power could fall if they crossed the wrong line. Either way, he was fair game for ridicule. Things hit rock bottom when a group of inmates cornered him in the yard one afternoon. They didn't lay a hand on him, not directly, but their words cut deep. "You think you're better than us?" One sneered. "Look where you are now." Another chimed in. "Guess your badge don't mean much in here, huh?" He stood frozen, unsure whether to fight back or walk away. Eventually, a guard stepped in, breaking up the confrontation before it escalated further. That night, lying awake on his bunk, he replayed the scene over and over in his mind. For the first time, he started to wonder if maybe he deserved this. But prison wasn't just about punishment. It also offered unexpected opportunities for reflection. The facility had a chaplain who ran weekly counseling sessions, open to anyone willing to attend. At first, the officer resisted. He didn't see the point. What good would talking do? But after another sleepless night filled with regret and self-loathing, he decided to give it a shot. Maybe, just maybe, someone might help him make sense of the mess he'd created. The chaplain was patient, listening without judgment as the officer opened up about his past. Slowly, pieces of the puzzle began to emerge. The frustrations, the biases, the moments when prejudice clouded his judgment. He admitted that he'd always believed he was doing the right thing, enforcing the law the way it was meant to be enforced. But as he spoke, he realized how often his assumptions had led him astray. He thought back to the faces of the people he'd targeted, the ones who had spoken out against him during the trial. Their voices echoed in his mind, accusing him of seeing them not as individuals but as stereotypes. Over time, these sessions forced him to confront uncomfortable truths about himself. Was he truly sorry for what he'd done? Or was he just sorry he'd gotten caught? Did he genuinely want to change? Or was he simply trying to survive prison life? These questions gnawed at him, keeping him up at night. There were moments when he felt genuine remorse, flashes of clarity where he understood the harm he'd caused. Other times, old habits crept back in, and he convinced himself that the system had failed him too. Outside the prison walls, society grappled with its own reflections. The trial had sparked a national conversation about policing, accountability, and reform. Lawmakers introduced bills aimed at increasing transparency within departments, requiring body cameras for every officer, and creating independent oversight boards to investigate misconduct. Activists pushed for even bolder changes, calling for defunding certain aspects of law enforcement and reallocating resources toward community programs. Not everyone agreed on the solutions, but most could agree on one thing: something needed to change. Communities stepped up too, organizing town halls and workshops to discuss what safer, fairer policing might look like. Parents taught their children about rights during interactions with officers. Teachers incorporated lessons on civil rights into their curriculums. Even local businesses joined the effort, hosting panels and fundraisers to support organizations working toward reform. The energy was palpable, a collective determination to turn outrage into action. Law enforcement agencies weren't immune to the pressure either. Many departments launched internal reviews, examining policies and practices that might perpetuate bias. Training programs shifted focus, emphasizing de-escalation techniques and cultural sensitivity. Some officers embraced these changes, recognizing the need to rebuild trust with the public. Others resisted, arguing that reforms would make their jobs harder or put them at greater risk. Tensions flared, but progress, however slow, continued. Amidst all this, the FBI director remained a steady presence. He continued to advocate for systemic change, using his platform to push for legislation and funding initiatives aimed at addressing root causes of inequality. He visited schools, speaking to students about leadership and responsibility. He met with community leaders, listening to their concerns and brainstorming solutions. His calm demeanor and unwavering commitment inspired many, though critics still accused him of not doing enough. To them, he responded with patience, reminding everyone that real change takes time and effort from all sides. As months passed, the story of the disgraced officer faded from headlines, replaced by newer scandals and crises. But the ripple effects of his downfall lingered. Police academies began teaching cadets about the dangers of unchecked bias. Journalists wrote investigative pieces exploring patterns of misconduct across different departments. Artists painted murals honoring victims of police brutality, turning pain into art. The movement sparked by this single incident showed no signs of slowing down. Back in prison, the officer's transformation remained uncertain. Counseling sessions helped him see glimpses of a different path, but old habits died hard. Whether he emerged from incarceration a changed man or returned to his old ways remained to be seen. What was clear, however, was that his story served as a cautionary tale, a reminder that actions have consequences, and accountability waits for no one. And so, as the nation moved forward, carrying both scars and lessons from this chapter, 1, truth stood firm. Justice isn't just about punishing wrongdoing, it's about building a better tomorrow. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long while, there was hope that meaningful change might finally take root. By the time the officer completed his prison sentence, 5 years had passed. The world outside had changed in ways he couldn't have imagined when he first walked through those cold steel doors. Society had moved forward, but scars from the past still lingered. Some healed, others raw and aching. For him, stepping back into freedom felt like walking onto unfamiliar ground. Everything was different. The streets, the people, even the air seemed heavier with expectation. His release didn't go unnoticed. Reporters camped outside the prison gates, microphones ready, cameras rolling. They wanted answers. Was he sorry? Had he learned anything? Did he think he deserved what happened to him? But he avoided them. slipping out quietly through a side entrance. He wasn't ready to face the public yet. Maybe he never would be. The first few months on the outside were tough. Finding work proved nearly impossible. No one wanted to hire an ex-cop with a criminal record, especially not one whose face had been plastered across newspapers and TV screens for years. He applied for jobs at gas stations, warehouses, anywhere that might take him, but rejection letters piled up faster than he could count. Friends and family kept their distance too, unsure of how to interact with someone who had fallen so far. Loneliness became his constant companion. Eventually, he landed a job as a janitor at a small community center. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid enough to get by. Sweeping floors and cleaning bathrooms gave him plenty of time to think, to reflect, on where he'd gone wrong and whether redemption was even possible. At first, he hated the humiliation of being treated like invisible help, ignored by the same kinds of people he used to command respect from. But over time, something shifted. He began noticing the little things, the way kids smiled at him when he fixed a broken swing, the gratitude in someone's voice when he helped carry groceries to their car. These moments, though small, reminded him that humanity existed beyond titles and badges. At night, he often found himself sitting alone in his tiny apartment, staring at the walls. Memories of his old life haunted him, the power he once held, the mistakes he made, the lives he damaged along the way. Sometimes guilt overwhelmed him, leaving him breathless and unable to sleep. Other times he wondered if anyone really cared about changing anymore. Wasn't it easier to just let the past stay buried? But then there were days when hope crept in unexpectedly. One afternoon, while mopping the floor at the community center, he struck up a conversation with a young boy practicing basketball drills nearby. The kid asked why he always worked late shifts. When the officer shrugged and said it was just part of the job, the boy replied, "You must be pretty brave to keep showing up every day." Those words stuck with him. Brave? Him? After everything he'd done, yet somehow hearing them made him feel lighter. Word spread slowly around the neighborhood about the man who cleaned the community center. Some residents recognized him from news reports, but instead of hostility, they offered cautious curiosity. A few invited him to join potluck dinners or holiday gatherings. At first he declined, afraid of judgment, but eventually hunger for connection outweighed fear, and he accepted an invitation to a summer barbecue. Sitting awkwardly among strangers, he listened as people shared stories about struggles, resilience, forgiveness. For the first time in years, he realized he wasn't the only one carrying burdens. Meanwhile, the broader movement for reform continued gaining momentum. Activists pushed harder than ever, demanding accountability and transparency within law enforcement. Departments implemented new training programs focused on empathy and de-escalation. Body cameras became standard equipment and independent oversight. Boards gained more authority to investigate misconduct. While progress remained uneven, signs of change were undeniable. The FBI director played a key role in driving this transformation. He traveled extensively, speaking at conferences, meeting with lawmakers, and visiting communities affected by police violence. His message was simple yet powerful. Justice isn't just about punishing bad actors. It's about creating systems that prevent harm in the first place. He acknowledged that trust wouldn't return overnight, but insisted that persistence mattered more than perfection. Back at the community center, the former officer started volunteering for youth programs. Coaching basketball teams, leading art workshops, organizing mentorship sessions. It gave him purpose again. Kids gravitated toward him, drawn to his quiet demeanor and willingness to listen. Parents, initially wary, warmed up after seeing the positive impact he had on their children. Slowly, he rebuilt pieces of himself, brick by fragile brick. One evening, during a town hall meeting, someone asked him directly, "Do you regret what you did?" The room fell silent, all eyes turning to him. He hesitated, swallowing hard before answering. "Yes," he said finally, his voice trembling. "I regret it every single day. I hurt people and I can't take that back. All I can do is try to be better moving forward." The crowd erupted in murmurs, some nodding approvingly, others exchanging skeptical glances. Not everyone believed. Him, not yet, but many appreciated his honesty. Over time, his efforts earned him a fragile kind of acceptance. Redemption wasn't easy, nor was it guaranteed, but he understood now that it required action, not just words. Years later, when historians looked back on this period, they saw it as a turning point, a moment when accountability collided with possibility. The disgraced officer's story became a footnote in larger discussions about justice and reform. For some, it represented failure. For others, it symbolized hope. What mattered most was that it forced people to confront uncomfortable truths and inspired them to demand better. As for the man himself, he lived quietly, content to remain in the background. He knew he'd never fully escape the shadow of his past, nor should he. But each sunrise brought a fresh chance to prove that change, however difficult, was always worth pursuing. And in that quiet determination lay a lesson for everyone. Even in our darkest moments, we have the power to choose how we move forward.